A life I'd built over years crumbled in seconds that Thursday afternoon. The clock read 2:43 p.m. when I opened the door, excited to surprise Elizabeth with my early return from Singapore. 3 months apart felt like an eternity, but every sacrifice had been worth it for our future. The silence in the house was off, different from usual. Still holding the suitcases, I went straight upstairs to our bedroom. The door, left ajar, revealed something my brain refused to process. Clothes scattered all over the floor, and a man's suit that I recognized immediately. On the bedside table lay the watch I'd given Jackson on his birthday. I froze. The sound of the shower in the master bath echoed like a distant hum. At that moment, I didn't yet know that the betrayal had resulted in a pregnancy, but I already felt that my life had just been changed forever. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The following weeks blurred by in forced normality. I kept my discovery to myself, watching Elizabeth and Jackson carry on with their lives as if nothing had happened. She still acted like the devoted wife, cooking my favorite meals and asking about my days at the office. And he, my so-called best friend since college, still invited me for our usual Saturday tennis matches. Then, one Sunday morning, the baby shower invitation arrived. Elizabeth handed it to me with tears in her eyes, saying she had a wonderful surprise to share. My stomach churned when she revealed the pregnancy, but I kept smiling. I had to wait for the right moment. The event took place in our backyard. I scrutinized every detail: the blue and pink balloons, the delicately decorated sweets, the presents piled on the table. My mother-in-law, Margaret, was running the show, handing out smiles and hugs while whispering to the guests about how proud a grandmother she'd be. The moment that shattered the lie came during the thank you speech. Elizabeth, radiant in her floral dress, was holding Jackson's hand as she announced he would be the baby's godfather. That's when I noticed the knowing look they exchanged, the way their fingers interlaced subtly, and the blush on their faces. My own parents were there too, avoiding my gaze. Later, I'd learned that they had known about everything for months. The cheerful decor, the smiles, the congratulations, everything felt like a cruel joke. Amid the applause from the guests, I silently got up and left the garden. The sound of congratulatory claps faded as I headed upstairs to our room, determined to start my revenge at that very moment. I waited until all the guests had left. The sound of cars driving away felt like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation. Elizabeth climbed the stairs, calling me with that sweet voice that now filled me with disgust. She found me in my home office, sorting through documents. "Why did you leave like that? Everyone was asking where you were," she said, still holding a piece of the baby shower cake. Jackson appeared just behind her, his presence making the air even heavier. I calmly got up and placed a few photos on the table. They were pictures of them together, records of secret meetings that a private investigator had gathered over the past few weeks. Elizabeth turned pale, dropping the piece of cake onto the light-colored carpet. "Alex, it's not what you're thinking," Jackson tried to explain, stepping forward. "We can talk about this." "Talk? You two talked about this kid? About how long you'd wait to tell me? Or maybe about how you plan to make me raise your child?" My voice was steadier than I expected. Elizabeth began crying, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. "It was a mistake, Alex. We never wanted this to happen. A mistake that went on for months," I replied, tossing more photos onto the table. "While I was working on another continent building our future, you were tearing everything down here." Jackson tried putting his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that used to be familiar among friends. I stepped back as if his touch burned me. "Don't even think about touching me. 15 years of friendship, and you—" "Alex, please," Elizabeth begged. "Think about the baby. We can work something out." "Work it out?" I laughed bitterly. "It's done. You chose this. Now deal with the consequences." I grabbed my briefcase and walked to the door. "The divorce papers will be here tomorrow. And Jackson, that project we presented together at the company last week? I pulled my name off it earlier today. Good luck explaining the report discrepancies to the board." I left them paralyzed in the office. The sound of Elizabeth's sobs and Jackson's desperate shouts followed me down the stairs. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control again. The days after the confrontation turned into weeks of total isolation. I rented a penthouse on the opposite side of the city, ignoring the dozens of calls and messages that came in daily from Elizabeth, Jackson, my parents, Margaret, all trying to explain, justify, or downplay what had happened. I spent hours looking out the window on the 30th floor, reliving every moment of the past few months. The signs were all there: secret phone calls, work meetings that stretched late, Elizabeth's sudden interest in events that Jackson attended. I was too busy building an empire to notice that my own castle was falling apart. The nights were the worst. The silence of the empty apartment forced me to face thoughts I'd been trying to avoid during the day. Images of them together invaded my mind. The child growing inside her, a constant reminder of the betrayal, was supposed to be mine. I threw myself into work like never before. 18-hour days at the office, endless contract reviews, back-to-back meetings, anything to keep my mind occupied. My employees noticed the change too. The easy smile had been replaced by a serious, determined look. I stopped going to our usual hangouts. The tennis club where Jackson and I had played became just another building on the horizon. The Italian restaurant where I had taken Elizabeth to celebrate our wedding anniversary turned into another darkened window in the night. One morning, I found a letter from my parents at the front desk. They explained that they'd tried to protect me, that they didn't know how to tell me about the betrayal. I burned the letter before finishing it. Their protection had allowed the lie to grow, turning the betrayal into something irreparable. The bathroom mirror now reflected a different man. My eyes had lost the shine of innocence, replaced by a calculating stare. Sleepless nights left their marks, but they also brought clarity. The pain was turning into something more productive, determination. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I began planning my revenge step by step. It wouldn't be impulsive or emotional. It had to be precise, legal, and devastating. They chose to destroy my life in secret. I chose to destroy theirs in plain sight. Planning my revenge was like a chess game. Every move had to be meticulously calculated. First, I hired the best lawyers in town, not to fight over the divorce, but to dig up every secret and every vulnerability that could be legally exploited. I found out that Jackson had committed minor fraud in the company's financial reports, tweaking numbers to impress the higher-ups. I'd always known about it. I'd even helped cover up some of those changes years ago when our friendship still meant something. Now, that information would be his downfall. Elizabeth had her own set of secrets. Her art gallery, which she ran with so much pride, was involved in several tax irregularities. She had trusted me with managing the bookkeeping, never imagining that her shady decisions would come back to haunt her. I gathered evidence, proof, documents, and witnesses. Every incriminating paper was carefully organized into digital and physical folders. The evidence of the betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. The real blow would come through the system they thought they knew so well. For weeks, I worked quietly. I discreetly transferred my assets to safe accounts, protected my investments, and strengthened my professional alliances. Every move was executed with surgical precision, raising no suspicions. I set up strategic meetings with key members of the company board. I didn't have to lie. I simply presented the facts I'd uncovered about Jackson's shady practices. The look of panic on his face when he was unexpectedly summoned for an audit gave me the first taste of satisfaction since I discovered the betrayal. For Elizabeth, the process was just as calculated. Anonymously, I sent compromising documents about her gallery to the tax authorities. Her reputation in the art world, years in the making, was about to quietly crumble. Margaret, my meddling mother-in-law, wouldn't escape unscathed either. She had invested a considerable sum in her daughter's gallery, a decision I'd convinced her of years ago. Now, that investment was turning into a financial nightmare. The plan even included my parents, not out of personal vendetta, but as a consequence. Their silent complicity would cost them our relationship. I canceled the financial support that went into their charity projects, which, by the way, depended mainly on my donations. Every night I reviewed the details of the plan. The spreadsheets on my computer showed a precise timeline of legal and financial maneuvers. There was no room for emotion or hesitation. Each move was designed to hit with maximum impact, within the bounds of the law. The most difficult part was keeping up the appearance of normality. I continued showing up at social events, smiling in the company hallways, and politely answering questions when people inquired about Elizabeth and the baby. No one suspected that behind that controlled behavior, a storm was about to break loose. One evening, as I looked out at the city from my new apartment window, I realized that the man I used to be, the one who believed in second chances and forgiveness, died the moment I opened that bedroom door that fateful afternoon. In his place stood someone stronger, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Revenge wouldn't be quick or dramatic. It would be slow, methodical, and irreversible. The divorce process began like a silent tsunami. My lawyers served Elizabeth the papers during her work hours at the gallery, right in front of her employees and some important clients. Public humiliation was just the beginning. The document detailed not only the infidelity, but also laid out concrete evidence of the prolonged relationship with Jackson. The dates, locations, and attached photographs left no room for dispute. The news spread quickly among our social circle, turning Elizabeth into the main subject of gossip in town. Meanwhile, the audit at the company was exposing more and more irregularities in Jackson's reports. His work from the past 5 years was now under intense scrutiny. The auditors found exactly what I knew they would: years of data manipulation and small yet significant embezzlements. Elizabeth tried to negotiate, pleading for a discreet settlement. She offered to forego any financial claim in exchange for my silence over the betrayal. I refused. I instructed my lawyers to make every detail public in court. The privacy she so valued during this ordeal was about to be completely shattered. What should have been a joyful pregnancy turned into her worst nightmare. In the social circles she cherished, looks of judgment replaced the congratulations. Friends who had organized her baby shower now avoided her calls, afraid of being linked to the scandal. Margaret tried to intervene, threatening to use her social influence against me. I responded by releasing information about her own investments in the gallery. In just a few days, she found out that her money was tied up in a business on the edge of a tax investigation. The apartment we shared, purchased with my money before we got married, was put up for sale. Elizabeth was given 30 days to leave. Her attempts to contest the ownership were thwarted by a meticulously drafted prenuptial agreement. Jackson lost his position at the company after an extraordinary board meeting. His dismissal for cause even came with a 5-year ban from working in the industry. His professional reputation, built over a decade, collapsed in a single afternoon. Elizabeth's lawyers tried to use her pregnancy as leverage to secure a generous alimony. I countered by demanding a paternity test as soon as the baby was born, knowing that this would only deepen her public humiliation. Every legal move was precise and ruthless. There was no room for appeals to emotion or attempts at reconciliation. When Elizabeth showed up crying at the door of my new apartment, the building's security politely escorted her out, exactly as I had instructed. The legal battle dragged on for weeks, with each day delivering a new revelation, a new blow to their carefully built lives. I watched from afar as their worlds crumbled, piece by piece, consequence by consequence. My only response to their repeated attempts to contact me was through my lawyers. Every communication was cold, professional, and devastating. There was no longer the understanding husband or loyal friend, only a man determined to carry out a meticulously planned revenge through the most legal and destructive means possible. The impact of my revenge became increasingly visible. Jackson, once respected in the financial market, could barely land any job interviews. His name had become toxic in the industry, and companies steered clear of any association with him. The luxurious apartment he once took pride in was sold to cover his mounting debts. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was spiraling downward. The tax investigation into her gallery revealed far more irregularities than she had imagined. Major clients canceled contracts, artists pulled their works, and the local press began questioning the legitimacy of her past exhibitions. The baby grew up amid all the chaos. Elizabeth had to move into a modest apartment in the suburbs, a drastic change from the lifestyle she was used to. Her high society friends, who once vied for her attention, now didn't even return her calls. Margaret not only lost money, she also lost her clout in social circles. The scandal surrounding the gallery investments damaged the carefully built connections she had. Parties that she used to host now had guest lists that only kept getting smaller. Jackson tried to rebuild his career in another city, but my contacts in the market ensured that his reputation preceded him. Every door he tried to open shut before he even had a real chance. His savings dwindled rapidly, and his debts piled up. Elizabeth's gallery finally closed its doors after 3 months of intense investigation. The historical building she had transformed into her artistic sanctuary was emptied on one rainy afternoon. I watched from a distance as she stood by, witnessing the staff removing the last of the artwork, her 6-month pregnant belly, a living reminder of all the consequences. Jackson's lawyers attempted to negotiate a deal to clear his professional name. They offered a public confession of the affair in exchange for dropping the fraud charges. I refused. Every attempt at an out-of-court settlement was met with new lawsuits, new investigations, and even more damaging revelations. Margaret lost her position on the board of several charities after her involvement in the gallery's tax scheme was exposed. Her name, once a byword for philanthropy, now carried the heavy stain of financial scandal. Elizabeth tried publishing an open letter, apologizing and seeking public sympathy. The response was a deafening silence, broken only by critical comments on social media. Her attempt to portray herself as the victim only strengthened the narrative of the woman who betrayed her husband with her best friend. The apartment we once shared was finally sold. Elizabeth had to watch as strangers carried out the furniture we had chosen together, each piece a memory of the life she destroyed. Her share of the sale barely covered her lawyer's fees. Jackson, desperate, tried to set up a meeting with me through mutual friends. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to seek some form of redemption. My response was another lawsuit for moral harassment. I watched from a distance as their lives crumbled like a house of cards. Every pillar that once supported their existence, money, social status, relationships, reputation, was methodically destroyed. Not through violent outbursts or dramatic acts, but through calculated and perfectly legal maneuvers. The destruction I planned proved far more effective than any direct confrontation could have been. They lost not only what they had, but, more importantly, who they were. The attempts at reconciliation began once the reality of their ruined lives became unbearable. Elizabeth was the first. She sent a handwritten, 12-page letter detailing her remorse. She described how perfect our life together once was, how deeply she regretted every moment spent with Jackson, and how the baby shouldn't determine our fate. Jackson tried a different approach. He showed up in the lobby of my corporate building, pleading for 5 minutes of conversation. Security escorted him out while he shouted apologies and promises of redemption. His wife had filed for divorce, his children no longer wanted to see him, and now he finally understood the weight of his actions. Margaret organized a dinner with mutual friends, attempting to create an atmosphere for reconciliation. I declined the invitation by sending copies of the tax investigation documents to all the guests. The dinner got canceled, and even a few of Elizabeth's friends drifted away. My parents tried to intervene during a Sunday lunch. They talked about forgiveness and how holding grudges only hurt me. I responded by showing them photos of the betrayal and asking if they could forgive that easily if they were in my shoes. They left in silence, finally understanding the depth of the wound their silence had helped create. Elizabeth showed up at my office when she was 8 months pregnant. Seeing her, vulnerable and visibly broken, didn't spark any sympathy in me. When she started feeling unwell, I called an ambulance and stepped out for a meeting. Later, I learned it had just been stress. Jackson tried using our tennis club friends as intermediaries. He sent messages reminiscing about our times together, the trips we took, the dreams we shared. Every message was met with new legal documents, adding more pressure on the investigations into his past activities. Elizabeth arranged a casual meeting at the cafe where we had our first date. She sat at our usual table, waiting for hours. I walked right past the window display, staring through it as if I were invisible. The tears I saw on her face no longer meant anything. One afternoon, Jackson left a box at the front desk of my building. Inside were all the gifts I'd given him over the years, along with a letter promising he'd disappear from my life if I just stopped the investigations. I donated the items to charity and ramped up the legal process. Margaret tried one last move, threatening to reveal some of my past secrets. I responded with a complete dossier on her own indiscretions, compiled over years of family life. Her silence was immediate and permanent. Every attempt at reconciliation only strengthened my resolve. There was no longer room for forgiveness or a fresh start. With each new plea, with every new call for mercy, I responded with another legal move, another devastating revelation. The forgiveness they begged for would be the very last thing they ever received from me. The destruction of their lives was my only reply to their attempts at reconciliation. The baby was born on a rainy October night. Elizabeth was alone in a public hospital, far from the premium care she had always imagined for that moment. Jackson showed up hours later, barred from entering due to visitation restrictions. The paternity test I demanded confirmed the obvious. The legal consequences were immediate. Jackson would have to pay child support from an income he no longer had. Elizabeth lost her last hope of any financial stability from the divorce. Margaret tried to set up a fund for her grandson, but her own finances were too compromised. The child was born into a world where his parents had already lost everything: money, respect, opportunities. The weight of their choices would now affect an innocent life. Elizabeth attempted to return to the art world as an independent consultant, but her name was too tainted. Every job proposal was turned down after a simple Google search. Jackson kept driving for ride apps, crashing on a friend's couch who still kept in touch. The divorce was finalized without contest. Elizabeth didn't even show up for the final hearing. She was represented solely by her lawyer. Jackson lost his appeal against his termination for cause. Both of them continued to accumulate debts, with interest they'd never be able to pay off. My lawyers ensured that I'd have no legal obligation toward the child. The paternity test was attached to the divorce papers, protecting me from any future claims. Elizabeth and Jackson would have to face the consequences of their choices on their own. Their story became a cautionary tale among the city's social circles, a reminder of the cost of betrayal and what happens when you underestimate someone you trusted and who was betrayed. Their lives, once envied and admired, now served as an example of what not to do. The final blow came when Jackson had to move to another state, unable to maintain any stable employment in the city. Elizabeth, now living with her mother, had to sell her last remaining jewels to buy the bare necessities for the baby. And Margaret, socially isolated, rarely left her house. Revenge was complete, not through violence or scandal, but by systematically and legally dismantling everything they valued. The price of their betrayal would be paid for the rest of their lives. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. A year passed since it all began. Sitting in the office of my new penthouse in Manhattan, I watched the city that never sleeps. Moving to New York marked the beginning of my true liberation. The company expanded, my career took off, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal. Occasionally, I'd hear bits and pieces about them from mutual acquaintances. Elizabeth now works as a saleswoman in a department store, while Jackson moved to a small Midwestern town where no one knew his story. Margaret sold her house and now lives in a modest apartment, far from the social spotlight she once adored. Some say I was too cruel, that revenge turned me into a heartless man. Maybe they're right, but this transformation gave me something far more valuable than compassion: freedom. Freedom from lies, from expectations, from false loyalties. My parents eventually realized that their silence had contributed to everything. Our relationship is different now, more distant, but at least it's built on truth. I no longer have to pretend to trust anyone blindly. The pain of betrayal never completely goes away, but it no longer defines who I am. I turned it into fuel for my own growth. Every decision I made during my quest for revenge taught me more about strength, determination, and self-preservation. Today, when I look back, I do so without regret, knowing that every action was necessary to rebuild myself. Revenge didn't bring me happiness. It brought something even more important: control over my own destiny. I'm no longer the man who was betrayed. I'm the man who rose from the ashes of that betrayal and built something bigger, stronger, and entirely my own. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.